He awoke to silence, not the sacred stillness of the Chapel of Heroes, nor the disciplined quiet before a strike. This was the silence of extinction. Beneath the shattered bones of a fortress once dedicated to the Emperor's light, Brother Sergeant Cale of the Ultramarines drew a ragged breath that tasted of ash. His Vox grill hissed softly as it fought to cycle air through, filters long clogged with promethium dust. Around him, the world burned in slow motion, embers drifting through the ruin, like ghosts reluctant to leave. He did not know how long he had been here. Hours, perhaps days. Time had lost its discipline in this forsaken crater of the Imperium. His brothers had died one by one, cut down by a tide of green-skinned monstrosities, whose laughter had filled the night. Now even their laughter was gone. The battlefield had become a tomb, and Cale its solitary guardian. They said that Space Marines do not feel despair, that their gene-wrought hearts know only duty and devotion. But as Cale stared at the broken standard of the Aquila buried in the mud, he understood what the chaplains never spoke aloud. Duty without purpose is torment. The Emperor's will might yet burn across the stars, but here, on this forgotten world, his light had flickered out. Somewhere beyond the storm clouds, ships still fought in his name. But no Vox signal reached him, no drop pod fell, no prayer was answered. Cale was left behind, abandoned perhaps, or overlooked by the endless machinery of war. And in the stillness between breaths, he began to wonder whether the Emperor even knew his name. If you walk with Cale through this shattered world, if you wish to, hear what becomes of a Space Marine when the Imperium forgets him, then stay beside us. Share this story so that his name, at least, will not vanish into the dark. Subscribe and carry his memory, for in the grim darkness of the far future, remembrance is the only form of mercy. The world was ash when Cale awoke, beneath a sky bruised black by smoke and planetary firestorms. The once holy soil of the Imperium had turned to slag, pitted with the craters of orbital bombardment, and littered with the broken shells of men who had called themselves immortal. His armor, proud once in the blue and gold of the Ultramarines, was now dulled with soot and streaked with the blood of brothers whose names he could no longer recall. The air stank of ozone, oil, and death, a metallic taste that clung to the back of his throat like confession. He rose slowly, his power armor whining in protest, servos grinding as if echoing the fatigue in his soul. Around him sprawled the remains of the Ninth Company, their bodies frozen in poses of defiance and prayer, bolters clutched to chests that would never rise again. The banners of the Emperor lay torn across the mud, their Aquilas soaked in rain and blood until both seemed the same color. Cale's Vox clicked faintly, a static whisper that promised salvation but delivered only the empty breath of a dead channel. He tried the chapter frequency again, speaking words drilled into him by decades of unbending command. Ultramarines 9th, Brother Sergeant. Cale, requesting status. Only silence answered. He stood there for a long moment, the kind of stillness that makes time dissolve, then lowered his helm. There had been victory once, brief and savage. He remembered the roar of the Thunderhawks, the orcs breaking beneath disciplined fire, the cleansing flame of promethium washing over Xenos filth. He remembered, too, the counterstrike, how the ground had erupted beneath them, how the skies had screamed, and how everything after had become nothing. Astartes are taught to endure beyond pain, beyond loss, beyond hope. Yet standing amid the ruins, Cale felt the faintest tremor within his two hearts, a whisper he dared not name. Duty, he reminded himself, was eternal. But what is duty when the war has moved on without you? He began to walk, boots crunching over shattered ceramite and bone. The world was strangely beautiful in its ruin. Flames dancing over pools of oil, the distant mountains glowing like coals beneath the storm's reflection. Each step carried the weight of ghosts. He passed Brother Varan, whose chainsword still hissed weakly, its teeth stuck in the rib cage of an orc knob. Brother Corvus, half buried under a collapsed wall, his helmet visor cracked but the light within still dimly pulsing. Brother Ionis, seated upright against a broken pillar as if still at watch. Cale paused to press a gauntlet against each, murmuring the litanies of release in a voice low and rough. They fought. They served. They are remembered. The words sounded hollow against the void. A flicker of movement caught his eye, a servitor dragging itself across the wreckage, its limbs sparking, one mechanical eye glowing faintly red. It paused before Kale, Vox Grill sputtering an incomplete benediction. "For the Emperor, serve," before collapsing into stillness. He knelt, laying 2 fingers on its cold brow. Even a machine deserved last rites. When he rose again, the wind had shifted, bringing with it the distant echo of thunder, or perhaps engines, though it was impossible to tell. He turned toward the sound, scanning the horizon through the haze. The landscape stretched endless and wounded. No beacons, no dropships, no banners, just ruin. The realization settled slowly, not as shock but as inevitability. The Imperium had moved on. Reinforcements had come and gone, or perhaps none had ever been sent. He was a relic now, a fragment of war left to rust in the aftermath. And yet his duty remained, heavy as the bolter on his back. He found a rise of stone, overlooking what had once been a manufactorum, and knelt there, planting his blade into the earth beside him. The silence pressed close, almost reverent. "Emperor," he said softly, voice distorted through his helm. "I live. And if I live, then my purpose is not done." But in his hearts, he wondered whether the Emperor could still hear him at all. Across the gulf of stars and the weight of 1,000 forgotten worlds, the sky rumbled again, faint and far away. Kael looked up, eyes catching the dull reflection of his visor in the dying firelight. For the first time since his creation, he felt something dangerously close to fear. Not of death, but of meaning slipping away. He tightened his grip on his weapon and whispered the only truth left to him. "Then I will be the last voice of Ultramar," and as the wind carried, the ashes of his brothers across the scorched plain. Brother Sergeant Kyle began to walk into the storm, alone, a single shadow against a world that had already forgotten him. Kale walked until the days lost their count and the horizon ceased to change. The sun trapped forever behind the storm's black veil. The silence that followed him was not empty. It was filled with the echoes of memory, the murmur of distant catechisms, the faint half-imagined hum of the chapel on Macragga, where once his name had been spoken with pride. Now it was just him and the endless ritual of endurance. Each morning, or what passed for it beneath the unending gloom, he would rise from the hollow of broken stone where he rested, cleanse his armor with the ashes of the battlefield, and recite the litanies of purpose. Pain is duty. Duty is life. Life is the Emperor's will. The words kept him sane, or so he told himself, even as their meaning bled away with repetition. He repaired what he could, recalibrating his bolter, sealing cracks in his armor with melted ceramite scraped from fallen brothers, adjusting his helmet's vox until it hissed less like a dying spirit. At night he built small cairns for the dead, improvised tombs, made of rock and metal, and carved their squad markings into each one. There were many cairns now, scattered like broken teeth across the plain. In time he began speaking to them softly, as if they still stood in formation beside him. He told them of the storm patterns, of the distant flashes of lightning that might have been ship fire, of the faint rhythmic tremor he sometimes felt beneath his boots, like a heartbeat pulsing deep below the earth. It was madness, perhaps, but even madness was preferable to the void. Once, while scavenging among the ruins of a manufactorum, Kale discovered a data slate miraculously intact beneath a collapsed pile of scrap. Its surface flickered weakly as he powered it through his armor's auxiliary port. For a moment, a voice filled his helm, thin, mechanical, but unmistakably human. "Worker shift 224B complete. Glory to the Emperor. Production quota, 90% efficiency." Then the feed dissolved into static. He sat there for a long while, staring at the dead device as if it were a relic. 90% efficiency. Even in death, the Imperium measured its worth by production. It was comforting, in a bleak way, a sign that the great machine of humanity still turned. Indifferent but enduring, Kale carried the data slate back to his shelter and placed it upon a rock, beside the skull of a fallen brother. A shrine of sorts, a reminder that he was not the last remnant of purpose. The next day, he found a broken servitor torso, its Vox grill fused shut, its single optic lens dark. He dragged it to the cairn, pried open its chest cavity, and recited the benediction of continuance, as if by ritual alone he could resurrect something of the Imperium's heartbeat. The wind howled through the ruins like a choir of lost souls, answering his prayer with nothing but echo. Days blurred into one another. His body functioned as it was engineered to, nutrient reserves sustaining him. Armor feeding filtered air into his lungs, but his mind began to drift toward questions Astartes should entertain. What becomes of duty when there are no orders left to follow? Is loyalty still sacred if no one remains to command it? At times, he thought he could hear the chaplain's voice rebuking him from memory. A space marine does not question. He obeys. Yet obedience required a master, and Kale's had vanished into the void. The Emperor's name still burned on his tongue, but it had become something fragile, no longer the battle cry of faith, but the whisper of a lost child searching for home. He began to dream, though Astartes rarely do, dreams of Terra, of the endless golden spires shimmering beneath the Astronomican's light, of the roar of the crowd when he had first taken the oath of moment. But the faces in those dreams were faceless now, their features blurred by time and distance. When he woke, the ache in his chest felt deeper than any wound. One evening, while collecting fragments of ammunition from the battlefield, Kale found the shattered remains of a helmet, bearing the markings of the Astra Militarum. Within it, still clutched by skeletal fingers, was a locket, a tiny thing, dented and smeared with soot. Inside was a faded image of a woman and child, the kind of relic the Astartes were taught to disdain, for attachments were weakness. And yet, staring at it, Kale felt something stir, recognition of what his kind had, sacrificed to become instruments of war. He placed the locket carefully beside the data slate, whispering a verse from the Catechism of Mourning. All serve, all end, all return to dust. That night, he dreamt not of war, but of peace, of fields unburned, of skies unbroken, of voices singing hymns not to conquest but to mercy. When he awoke, his helm filters were wet with condensation that might have been moisture, or perhaps tears. Weeks or months later, Kale began to sense that he was not entirely alone. It started as faint disturbances in the dust, small tracks that appeared near his shelter, never approaching too closely. Once he found an offering, a handful of wild berries, laid neatly beside one of his cairns. The gesture was too deliberate to be the work of beasts. He followed the tracks once, moving through the ruins like a shadow, bolter at the ready. But when he reached the edge of the valley, the footprints vanished as if the earth itself had swallowed them. He considered calling out, but the words died in his throat. The living were dangerous in this world. Kindness was often a trap. Still, the next morning he left a ration pack near the same cairn, and when he returned at dusk it was gone. He said nothing, but a quiet understanding settled in him, a fragile tether to existence, proof that life still stirred beyond his solitude. In time, his rituals became something more than survival. They became a liturgy of defiance. Each cairn, each repaired relic, each whispered prayer was a statement against oblivion. He began to inscribe words into the stone with the tip of his combat blade, not the codified prayers of the ecclesiarchy, but his own confessions. Half poem, half oath, I endure not for victory, but because I cannot cease. The act brought him a strange peace, as though carving his thoughts into the world made him part of its story again. Yet beneath that fragile purpose lingered a growing dread. Sometimes, in the half-light before rest, he thought he could hear whispers carried on the wind, voices speaking his name in tones too familiar, too intimate. He would rise, weapon ready, scanning the darkness, but find nothing. Once he caught his reflection in a pool of rainwater and did not recognize it. The ceramite was pitted and scarred, the ultramarine blue almost black, his visor reflecting not light but a dull crimson glow from within. He remembered the chaplain's words. A warrior becomes what he must to survive. The question was whether survival itself had become a sin. He stood one night atop a shattered bastion, watching the storm roll in from the mountains. Lightning split the clouds, illuminating the skeletal ruins of the manufactorum and the endless field of cairns he had raised. It struck him then that he was no longer simply guarding the dead, he was guarding their memory. Perhaps that was what the Emperor demanded of him now. Not battle, not conquest, but remembrance. A lesser man might have fallen to despair. But Cale found in this revelation a strange, grim serenity. The weight of duty had changed form, but it remained. It was the only thing keeping him tethered to what little humanity lingered beneath the armor. As the storm broke and the rain came down in sheets of silver fire, Cale lifted his head and let it wash the ashes from his armor. "For the Emperor," he whispered, though now it felt less like a cry of faith and more like a plea. In the distance, thunder rolled like cannon fire, and for a fleeting instant, Cale imagined he heard the march of his brothers once more. He closed his eyes and whispered into the storm, "I am still here." And the storm, vast and indifferent, whispered back. The third cycle of the storm came with a sound unlike thunder, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the marrow of the earth itself, echoing in Cale's bones like the tolling of some long-forgotten cathedral bell. It stirred him from uneasy half-sleep, his eyes flicking open behind his cracked helm as the hum deepened into a pulse, rhythmic and deliberate, too steady to be the work of wind or tectonic shift. He rose, bolter gripped in both hands, sensors sweeping the ruins that lay before him. The manufactorum's carcass loomed under the lightning, jagged against the storm, its towers bent like the ribs of a dead god. Something moved within the dark hollows, slow, precise, unhurried. He watched the motion with the discipline of centuries of training, tracking it until the rain veiled it from view. There were no orcs left alive. He had burned and buried enough to know their noise and stench. Whatever prowled these ruins was silent, deliberate, ancient. He advanced, each step muted by the mud, each breath measured by the rhythm of his twin hearts. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the skeletal remains of machinery, and the faint outline of a figure, tall, metallic, its limbs slender and impossibly still. For a moment, Cale thought it a statue, one of the machine saints that once adorned the manufactorum's facade, but then it moved with the eerie grace of precision long forgotten by human hands. The air grew colder as he drew near, his armor's auspex flickering with static, readings fragmenting into gibberish. When he reached the edge of the ruin, he saw it clearly, a figure of living metal, its surface gleaming wet in the storm light, eyes burning with pale green fire. A Necron. The sight should have filled him with the righteous fury of his gene line, the conditioned hatred of all that stood against humanity. But instead there was only a terrible stillness within him, a recognition of something profoundly wrong. The creature stood amidst the corpses of servitors and men, motionless as if contemplating them. Its long fingers moved in slow arcs, tracing symbols into the dust. Cale watched, unseen, as it paused to examine a skull, its metal face unreadable. Then, as if sensing his gaze, it turned. Their eyes met, green light against blue visor, and for an instant, Cale felt the weight of an age that mocked even the Imperium's arrogance. The Necron did not attack. Instead, it tilted its head, almost in curiosity, before retreating into the shadows of the ruin. Cale followed. Duty demanded the extermination of Xenos corruption. Survival demanded silence. He chose both, advancing like a wraith among ghosts. The corridors of the manufactorum were a maze of rust and bone, the walls slick with condensation, the air heavy with the scent of oil and decay. He moved deeper, guided by faint echoes of metallic footfalls, until he reached the central chamber, a vast space dominated by the shattered core of a reactor, its containment field long dead. And there, amidst the debris, the Necron knelt before a small, flickering hololith, a human hololith. It displayed the Imperial Aquila, fractured and glitching, its twin heads dissolving into static. The Necron stared at it as if studying a memory. Cale's finger tightened on the trigger, but something in that stillness stopped him. The Xenos raised its gaze, not toward him but upward, to the collapsing ceiling where rain poured through. It extended one arm, letting the water strike its metal skin, and a faint vibration filled the air, almost like a sound, low and mournful, resonating through the chamber. Cale realized with shock that it was a voice. Not words, but tone, an imitation of lament. The thought of such emotion in a creature of living metal was blasphemous, absurd yet undeniable. He took a step forward, armor groaning softly. The Necron turned, its gaze fixing on him once more. The chamber crackled with tension, two relics of different ages facing each other across the gulf of extinction. Kale spoke first, his voice a rasp through the vox. "You are a trespasser on Imperial soil." The Necron's head tilted slightly, as if parsing language it had once known. Then, in a voice like wind over stone, it replied, not in Gothic, but in something older, colder. The meaning struck Kale not through hearing, but through instinct. "All soil is grave." Then it moved. The battle was brutal, swift, and silent. Kale's bolter roared once, the explosive shell detonating against the Necron's torso, shattering part of its carapace but failing to halt it. The creature closed the distance with terrifying speed, claws slicing through the air. Kale ducked, countered, drove his combat blade into the Xenos' flank, twisting until green ichor sprayed across his armor. It staggered but did not fall. They collided again and again in a storm of sparks and thunder, blades ringing against metal, until finally Kale drove his blade through the creature's skull, pinning it against the reactor wall. It convulsed once, the light fading from its eyes, and then went still. Kale stood over it, breathing hard, his armor's servos whining in protest. He should have felt victory. Instead, there was only exhaustion and a strange, hollow grief. He looked around the chamber, the ruins of human labor, the husks of servitors, the flickering symbol of the Imperium, and felt the enormity of decay, pressing down on him. Even the enemies of mankind had returned to find only ruins. Perhaps that was the true inheritance of the galaxy, not conquest, not glory, but remembrance twisted into ruin. He left the manufactorum before dawn, though dawn meant little beneath the storm. The Necron's body remained where it fell, green light leaking from the wound like mist. As he stepped into the rain, Kale felt the hum beneath the ground fade, as if the planet itself had been holding its breath. He wondered how many such things slumbered across the galaxy, waiting for the silence of man. As he climbed the ridge overlooking the battlefield, he saw again the endless plains of ash and bone. The cairns stood like silent sentinels, his only congregation. He knelt among them, wiping the rain from his helm, and whispered to his fallen brothers, "There are ghosts here that even the Emperor forgot." The wind answered with a sigh. That night he could not sleep. The image of the Necron kneeling before the Aquila haunted him. What did it seek in that symbol? What memory of the Imperium's dawn could such a creature hold? He had been taught to see the galaxy in absolutes, light and darkness, faith and heresy, human and alien. But the longer he survived, the more those divisions blurred. Perhaps that was the curse of being left behind, to see the world as it truly was, stripped of scripture and command. He thought of his brothers, who had died believing themselves immortal, of the countless wars fought to preserve a dream that no longer recognized its dreamers. He raised his helm toward the storm, watching the lightning trace skeletal branches across the sky, and felt small for the first time in his existence. The galaxy was older than the Emperor, older than the Astartes, older even than war. Perhaps the Necron had understood that. Perhaps in its silence it had mourned not victory or defeat, but the futility of endurance. Kale rose with the wind at his back, his armor streaked with rain and dust, and began walking toward the distant mountains. The hum had faded, but in its absence, another sound took its place. A faint, intermittent crackle from his vox. Static but patterned, a voice buried in distortion. He stopped, turning his head as if to listen more closely. The sound came again, faint but unmistakable, a human voice calling through the interference. "I help." "By the throne! Anyone!" Kale's hearts quickened. It could be an illusion, a ghost of radio waves, or something real. He stared into the dark horizon where the signal seemed to come from. For the first time in uncounted days, there was something beyond routine, beyond survival. Hope, fragile and dangerous, flickered like a spark within him. He adjusted his vox to full range, sealing his helm, and whispered back into the void. "This is Brother Sergeant Kale of the Ultramarines." "Ninth!" "I hear you." The reply was faint but clear enough to make his blood run cold. "Help us!" "Emperor, forgive us. They're still here." Then the signal cut to static. Kale looked once more at the storm, at the graves, and at the distant mountains where the voice had come from. Duty stirred within him, not the blind obedience of old, but something deeper, older. He tightened his grip on his bolter and began walking toward the mountains. each step heavier than the last. The shadow that had walked among ruins was gone, but its echo lingered within him. Whatever waited ahead, he would face it. Not because he was ordered to, but because he could not bear to let the silence win. The silence had grown old by then, older than his armor, older than the wounds that refused to clot beneath his skin. He had stopped counting days, if days even existed anymore. The sun, or what passed for it, bled through a shroud of static clouds, staining the broken manufactoria in dull crimson light. He no longer knew if he still breathed in air or memory. And then, on the 33rd night since he had last heard the sound of his own voice, something whispered. It began not as sound, but as vibration, like the pulse of the ship's deck before a warp translation, a subtle tremor that hummed in the marrow. It coiled through the vox channels of his broken helm, whispering in binaric fragments, syllables that should have been meaningless. But they were not. They were familiar, intimate even, shaped like the prayer chants of the reclusiarchs before battle. The same tones that had once told him he was part of something eternal. He should have dismissed it as interference, another ghost of the ruined communications array. Yet something deeper than thought compelled him to listen. The words carried sorrow, not command, not threat. Sorrow. It was a voice trying to remember itself. He walked through the ruins, guided by the echo, each step punctuated by the grinding protest of ceramite against stone. The sound grew clearer as he descended, into the catacombs beneath the shattered shrine. He remembered the place, the halls where the wounded had been, brought before the bombardment, the vaults where the chaplains had recited the litanies of remembrance. The air there was colder than before, touched by the metallic tang of forgotten blood. A single lumen flickered weakly, its light falling across a mural half destroyed by shrapnel. It showed the Emperor upon his throne, his eyes radiant with golden fire, his hands raised over a line of warriors kneeling in reverence. He looked at their faces, stern, proud, immortalized in paint, and wondered if his own had ever looked like that. The voice returned, closer now, threading through the static like breath through a dying flame. Son of Dorn, it said. The name struck him like bolter recoil. It was not possible. His chapter was gone, the fortress monastery reduced to ash. Yet there it was, a voice shaped in the cadence of the old High Gothic, ancient and steady, filled with unbearable sadness. He knelt beside the mural, his gauntleted hand brushing dust from the carved aquila beneath it. For a heartbeat, the light around him flickered, and he saw the mural shift. The Emperor's eyes opened, not with golden fire, but with hollow darkness. His lips moved, and though no sound came, the Space Marine felt the words inside his skull. You are not forgotten. It was not comfort. It was command. He tore off his damaged helm, desperate for air, for clarity, for anything that would silence the echo. But the whisper persisted, resonating now within his chest, threading through his hearts, speaking in pulses rather than words. It showed him flashes, terror, radiant and distant. The golden throne burning like a dying star, the cries of the Astra Militarum echoing through endless trenches, a vision of 1,000 souls screaming their faith into the void just to be heard. The Emperor's light, the Astronomicon, pulsed across his vision like a heartbeat too vast to comprehend. And for one terrible moment, he felt it looking back at him. He stumbled to his feet, gasping, clutching at his chest plate as if to tear free from the suffocating presence within. Was this madness? Warp corruption? Or had the Emperor, in some unfathomable way, reached across the gulf of time and ruin to call him? He had been taught that no mortal could comprehend the God Emperor's will, that even the purest psyker would be unmade by a fraction of his thought. Yet this felt different, personal. It carried a human ache beneath its divine weight. The voice spoke again, softer now. Guard the flame was the same phrase his captain had shouted as the bombardment began, the same words inscribed upon the hilt of his chainsword. He looked down at the weapon, its edge chipped, its motor silent, and realized it was glowing faintly, the runes along its guard pulsing with pale light. He lifted it slowly, reverently, and the whisper faded into the faintest hum, as though satisfied he had heard. Around him, the ruins shifted. He could feel the world breathing again. The ash began to swirl in faint spirals, drawn toward the center of the chamber. Dust motes hung suspended in the dim light, glimmering like the remnants of stars. He took a step forward, feeling the presence press gently against his mind. Neither hostile nor merciful, but curious, an echo of something that had once been whole. Perhaps it was the machine spirit of the shrine awakening, perhaps a psychic scar left by the deaths of the faithful, or perhaps it truly was what his soul longed to believe. The Emperor, whispering through the fractures of reality. He knew better than to trust such things. The Codex warned of demons wearing faith as a mask. Yet even as the doubt gnawed at him, he could not let go of the fragile. Hoped that this voice was not a curse but a calling. He sank to one knee, lowering his head, the cracked aquila on his chest plate catching the faint glow that now filled the room. "I am your servant," he whispered, his voice breaking through the static for the first time in weeks. "Show me what remains to protect." The silence that followed was vast and patient, as if the void itself were listening. Then faintly, from somewhere beyond the veil of perception, came the sound of marching boots, the rhythm of thousands moving in perfect unison. It was not real. It could not be. Yet it filled him with purpose. He rose once more, his armor groaning, his heart steady. The voice from the void had not spoken again, but it had left something behind, a direction, a promise, a burden renewed. He turned toward the open night, toward the endless war that had forgotten his name, and began to walk. Behind him, deep within the shrine, the mural's eyes burned faintly with light that no lumen could cast. He had walked until the stars themselves seemed to wither, until the line between dream and waking no longer held meaning. Each step carried him deeper into the silence between worlds, a silence that was not absence but weight. The landscape had changed. The broken manufactoria gave way to vast plains of glass and bone, where the wind sang in tones that were almost human. He knew this could not be real, yet he also knew that reality had long ceased to obey the same laws it once did. The voice from the void had faded, but its resonance lingered, a pulse that drew him ever forward. In the distance he saw a light, weak, trembling, but impossibly steady. It was not fire, nor plasma, nor any forge-born glow. It was softer, purer, the kind of light he had seen only once before, when his ship had passed near the orbit of Terra, and the Astronomicon had filled the void with its divine radiance. Yet this light felt fragile, like a candle fighting against a storm. And as he approached, he realized the storm was not of wind or dust, but of memories, the echoes of every death, every prayer, every promise he had ever broken. He stopped at the crest of a shattered ridge and looked down upon what remained of a once holy fortress. The walls had collapsed inward, its banners burned to ash, yet in the center of its ruins stood a single statue still intact, a figure of the Emperor, his hands outstretched, his face calm and merciful. Around its base burned a flame no larger than a man's hand. He fell to his knees. It was the same fire that burned upon the altars of Terra, the same fire that chaplains swore was eternal. Yet here, on this forgotten world, it flickered like the breath of a dying god. He did not understand how it had come to be here, but he felt, with the certainty of faith, that this was what the voice had led him to protect. The last light of Terra, displaced, diminished, but still alive. He removed his gauntlet and reached toward it, and the air trembled. The flame leaned toward him, not with heat but with recognition, as if it had waited for his return. He saw faces within it, his brothers, his captain, the mortal soldiers who had once fought beside him. Each appeared for a moment, their features shimmering in the golden light, then dissolving into the ether. Their presence was not a haunting but a remembrance. The fire was made of memory, of sacrifice, of the countless lives burned in the Emperor's name. He bowed his head, his vision blurring, and whispered the litany of vigilance. His voice cracked, raw and unsteady, but the words flowed with reverence. When he finished, the wind fell still. The world seemed to hold its breath. And then, softly, the flame grew brighter. He felt its warmth spread through him, seeping through the fractures of his armor, through the scars of his flesh, through the hollow that grief had carved within his soul. For the first time since the fall, he felt something akin to peace. He understood now that the Emperor's light was not only in Terra's throne, nor in the great ships of the Imperium, nor even in the hearts of the faithful alone. It was in every act of endurance, Every soldier who refused to yield, every soul who whispered a prayer into the darkness and dared to believe it might be heard. This was the truth he had bled for and forgotten. The Imperium endured not because of strength, but because of belief. The voice from the void had not commanded him to rebuild or to avenge, but simply to guard this truth, fragile as flame. He stayed there for hours, perhaps days, guarding the light as if his life were the wick that sustained it. Once he thought he heard movement in the ruins, the faint hiss of a servitor, the shuffle of a pilgrim too fearful to approach. But when he looked, there was nothing. Only the wind carrying distant echoes of prayer. He began to speak to the flame as if it could hear him. He told it of his brothers, of their last stand, of the laughter that had once filled, their barracks before war made, silence their only companion. He confessed his doubts, his anger, his exhaustion. He spoke of the Emperor, not as God, not as master, but as the father he had never seen. And though the flame did not answer, it seemed to listen, steady and patient, as all holy things do. Then one night, he saw the sky break open. The stars rippled, and from beyond them came a single golden ray, faint but unmistakable. It fell across the plains, striking the flame, and for one breathless instant, the world was illuminated as if by dawn. He rose, instinctively snapping to attention, the reflex of a soldier answering a silent call. The light passed through him, filling his mind with visions of Terra shining in the void, of the custodian guard standing unmoving beside the golden throne, of the endless masses of humanity praying for salvation they would never see. He saw them all as threads in a vast tapestry, each fraying, each fragile, but together forming something eternal. When the light faded, the flame burned brighter still, steady now, unthreatened by the wind. He realized then that he was no longer alone. Around him, in the shadows, figures stood, men and women in tattered robes, their faces streaked with ash, their eyes wide with awe. Survivors, they, had followed the same whisper that had guided him. None spoke. They simply knelt, bowing their heads before the flame. He turned to them, his voice low, steady. "This is what remains," he said. "This is what must endure." And though he knew he could never rebuild the fortress, never restore the Imperium's glory, he felt no despair. For as long as the light burned, the memory of humanity's defiance lived on. He took one final look at the horizon. Somewhere far beyond sight, Terra still burned with the fire of 1 billion souls. He could not see it, but he could feel its pulse echoing through the void. He placed his helm upon the ground beside the flame, a final offering, and whispered, "For Dorn, for the Emperor." The wind rose again, carrying his words upward, scattering them into the endless night. He smiled, not as a warrior, but as a man who had finally understood the purpose of his suffering. When he turned away, the flame remained unshaken, casting its faint glow upon the ruins. It was not the light of victory. It was the light of endurance, the last light of Terra, and it would never die.